This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. You can join our conversation on Facebook and Twitter at WNPR Wheelhouse. As always, we discuss the week's news with Colin McEnroe. He's host of WNPR's Colin McEnroe Show. Hi there, Colin.
Good morning, Mr. Dankosky.
Also with us is Danny Haar. He's associate editor and columnist on business and the intersection of politics and economics. Do I have all that right? At Hearst, Connecticut Media. Hi there, Dan.
That's a mouthful. I have a goal this hour of getting 1,500 facts right.
Okay. That's your goal this hour.
Yes.
We're going to try to double that pledge. Yes. Daniela Altamari is here as well. She's State House reporter at the Hartford Courant. Hello there, Daniela.
Hi, how are you?
Well, I'm doing quite well. I didn't watch all the debate live because I think it went until around 1 o'clock in the morning. It was like an American League Championship Series game. I did, however, catch up on everything this morning. I'm sure that all of you watched intently over the course of a few hours last night. And I want to start there and maybe get some impressions on what was the same, what was different in last night's presidential debate. Colin, one of the big differences is it's a really big field. It's 12 people on stage. Not everyone's going to get the same amount of speaking time. If you take a look at some of the analysis of who gets to talk the most, it's not surprising that Elizabeth Warren is both the now frontrunner and she also got to speak for by far the most time. So that's one thing we can talk about. But what was your big takeaway?
Elizabeth Warren spoke for about 22 minutes, I think, and Biden came closest to her with 16. Excuse me. This is the most candidates who have ever debated in a presidential debate. We think of that 2015, 2016 Republican field as this gigantic thing, but I think 11 was the most people that they ever had on stage. So they were exceeded by one last night. I think the common headline is probably true, which is that Warren has emerged as a candidate who will be treated as a frontrunner for the foreseeable future. And to that end, I mean, there was, a pretty concerted effort to put her back on her heels a little bit last night. And at times, I think that was done somewhat effectively. I wish I had a real sort of snappy way of summing up, as you say, this very messy debate. It seems to me that ultimately these debates do prolong the proliferation of candidates, even though the debates are sometimes used to downsize the field a little bit. The truth is, at this point in the race, there probably should be like 5 or 6 candidates. Mm-hmm. And because, in fact, you have these debates where an awful lot of people, who for whatever reason are not going to be viable. I mean, Beto O'Rourke is not probably going to be the presidential nominee. Cory Booker, I don't understand why. Cory Booker's like this guy who touches the elevator lights and the buttons and they don't light up. I don't get that, actually. I think Cory Booker actually does a pretty good job most of the time. He's clearly not viable. So, it's weird because the debates, there are too many candidates. That causes problems for the debates, but the debates also perpetuate the problem. These people are not going away as long as they can qualify for debates.
Danny's shaking his head.
I don't agree that Cory Booker is not viable because as long as the field stays this big and as long as 3 of the 3 frontrunners have really, really serious political issues, Warren, in that she's just ideologically not in the place where she needs to be. Bernie Sanders, he did great after a heart attack. You got to admire him, but I think that's probably going to be a death knell to his campaign. And Biden, we know about. I think that either Buttigieg or Booker or Harris could emerge, and as Colin said, these things are prolonging the process. But everybody is not answering the questions. Everybody has talking points because they know that in these debates, they're forums, they're not debates, they're topical, right? So you bring up guns, right? So everybody has their talking point on guns, and by this point, their talking points are pretty well rehearsed. So. I agree with Colin that that's an atmosphere in which somebody else can emerge if one of those 3 stumbles, which they will.
I want to come back to you on the Elizabeth Warren thing, but I want to get Daniela's thoughts off the top. I mean, what did you make of last night's debate? Your big takeaways?
I think in some ways, the theme was it's the revenge of the moderates, right? They came out really aggressively. Mayor Pete, Amy Klobuchar, who has, again, probably is one of those second-tier candidates that Colin was referring to, came out really hard against Warren in particular. And, just in general, I mean, I think it was what was Pete's comment about Beto O'Rourke? I don't need any lectures from you on political courage or something like that. I'm paraphrasing, but I mean, just super aggressive. Pressing Warren on how are you going to pay for Medicare for all. You haven't said that. So I think that sort of wing, this big ideological struggle that we see within playing out in the Democratic field in 2020 in the party as a whole, I think was really spotlighted last night in a way that we hadn't seen that before.
And if you were to take one topic, and you touched on this already, Daniela, but it really is healthcare, and it's kind of the Medicare for all crowd and the public option crowd, and that is maybe the shorthand way to explain what's different about Amy Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren.
Yeah, I mean, for lack of a better term, the centrists or the moderates, are not in favor of dismantling private health insurance. Warren and Bernie have expressed support for that. Their plans would do that. So I thought there was a lot of talk and a lot of time and energy spent on that topic, and I think that is one of those big fault lines that we're seeing within the party.
Colin?
I would agree. First of all, I thought everything that Daniela said is absolutely true. And there's another word for moderates, and I think the other word is the old Democratic Party. I mean, basically, Klobuchar, Booker, Beto, Mayor Pete. These people are basically, and Biden, of course, are expressing what the Democratic Party was for decades and decades. And so Warren and Sanders are talking about big structural change. I think that's one of her key phrases. And I think some of the choice is going to boil down to that. I do think I'll be interested to see whether Warren can ultimately, either during this process or during the general election campaign, pivot a little bit away from where she is right now on health care. I think probably she needs to. There's three of these sort of big picture things that don't pull well for the Democrats. One of them is the complete elimination of private insurance in the course of reforming health care. Another one is the elimination of ICE, and the last one is reparations for African Americans. Those ideas, although they're interesting, good, big ideas, they may not be ideas that you would really want to run in on a national election. The question is, Warren, because she really comes across as a person committed at a level of conviction and principle, can she do something cynical ultimately, or a little bit cynical, and say, okay, I get it. I just don't have the support I would need for the healthcare plan that I've been talking about. Keep in mind, the healthcare plan she's always talking about is Bernie's healthcare plan. Yeah. It's not the Warren plan. It's the Bernie plan. So it might make it a little easier for her to slide away from that ultimately.
Yeah, I was going to say the only difference with the Warren plan and the Bernie plan, Dan, is that Bernie Sanders last night says very clearly, here's what's going to happen. You're not going to pay premiums. You're not going to pay for your health care. You are going to pay higher taxes. And when asked the same question, Elizabeth Warren does not say you're going to pay higher taxes.
One of I thought that was my favorite exchange. I'm glad you asked me about it. It was my favorite exchange of the whole thing because it was indicative of the candidate's inability to answer questions. I thought there should be a panel of judges, or maybe get Bill Curtis from Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, and have him ring a bell when somebody isn't answering a question. No, sorry. You have to answer the question. And she kept talking about costs, and it was to the detriment of the questioner. I think it was Anderson Cooper he just didn't say what you're saying is that overall costs are going to be lower, but she didn't make that clear, even though taxes are going up. Taxes are going up on the middle class. So that, I thought, the other broader or sort of deeper issue that I have with the movement to the left of the whole field, and not just the left, even the traditional Democrats are moving to the left in this process, is that there is talk of issues in regulation or deregulation, human rights, and taxes to finance. In none of these topics is anyone really talking about underlying reform. It's all how are we going to pay for this, and how are we going to pay for that, and how are we going to regulate this, and how are we going to regulate that. And I get that they're Democrats, but at some point somebody has to start talking about changing the way the underlying system works, whether it's immigration, taxes, health care, or anything else.
But underlying real reform in the case of healthcare does involve finding some way to address the cost question, right? I mean, Warren's right about that. If you don't control costs.
Price. All they're talking about is price. They're not talking about cost. They're talking about who's going to pay for it. No one is talking about how to take cost out of the system. Nobody.
But that would be underlying.
That would be, but that's not what they're talking about.
Well, I think the one thing that Elizabeth Warren talks about more than anything else, other than this health care plan, Daniela, is that somebody does have to pay for any of these things they're going to do, whatever the specifics are, and that is billionaires. It's the richest Americans are going to pay more, and that's something that we've heard once again. And that's something where it's not as clear an ideological dividing line, but it seems to be clear that most of the Democrats on stage are expecting that the richest people in America, including the richest guy on stage last night, Tom Steyer, are all going to pay more in this new world.
Yeah, and I mean that's sort of mirroring the debate we have had at the state capitol for the past few years. You know, who's gonna pay the tab? And you had first Governor Malloy and now Governor Lamont, both Democrats, solidly, some would say solidly progressive Democrats on a lot of issues. Yet both of them have also sort of refused to go that route. And it's interesting to note that, Governor Lamont is not just has endorsed Biden, but he's hosting a fundraiser for him, and he's very close to him in a lot of ways. So.
Yeah, Ned Lamont, Colin, endorsing Joe Biden. Meanwhile, AOC throws out a really interesting, I think, endorsement of Bernie Sanders last night that is going to happen within the next couple of days. And I'm not exactly sure what it says about this field. Maybe to Danny's point, it is setting up some ideological lines in terms of who a lot of Americans, especially in a place like Ohio where they were last night, might want to support. I don't know that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is somebody that a whole lot of people in Ohio are necessarily going to throw their support behind.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the endorsements of Omar and AOC, the so-called threesome from last night, they're probably a little bit more valuable in certain parts of the Democratic primary map, certainly more valuable there than they will be during a general election. And Connecticut is sort of weird, too. I mean, Connecticut is so old paradigm for the most part in terms of really prominent Democrats here. Johanna Hayes obviously is new. She may inject some kind of new thinking into all this stuff. But, basically, most of the congressional delegation, will do stuff like endorse Joe Biden in the teeth of evidence that, last night was not a good night for Joe Biden. I thought he stumbled and bumbled, and that issue of soft corruption around Hunter Biden's involvement in that company, that's not going to go away, and it would make it very hard for Biden to campaign against Trump if ethics becomes a big part of the 2020 campaign. I just want to say one thing last night that I did feel, which was that I thought in some ways the person who had the best night was Buttigieg. Buttigieg, I think, as we've said, there's a whole bunch of them fighting over one pork chop, and that pork chop is the chance to be the person who replaces Biden as the highest ranking moderate. And I think Buttigieg, he was coached clearly that he had to throw a couple of snowballs with rocks in them. He threw one of them at Beto. He threw another one at Warren. He had to get tough about a couple of things. But he is the kind of guy who can articulate a policy position and also keep in mind where he is in the pack. And he's showing, for a guy who's just the mayor of the fourth largest city in Indiana, he's showing some major league political skills as he goes through this process.
Well, yeah, and he may be a mayor of a city, Dan, but he's also, he's somebody who's served in the military. And so when finally, after all these debates, we start to talk a little bit about foreign policy because of the massive humanitarian crisis that is happening in Syria, he's actually got something to say, unlike a lot of the candidates.
Buttigieg also benefited from being the other military person on the other side of the debate from Tulsi Gabbard, who also served in Afghanistan, and so they had the intervention versus isolation debate between the two of them, and everybody else sort of sat that out for a few minutes, and that was great for him as well. I agree with Colin 100% on that. I just want to throw out there, I don't in any way agree at all that the 5th District Congresswoman is anything different in Connecticut than any. She is a traditional. Johanna Hayes,
you may be very right.
She is a traditional Democrat with traditional ideas, very cautious, installed by a traditional Democrat.
But I just want to also say, though, that she is, I think, the only member of the delegation who has endorsed somebody, and she endorsed Kamala Harris. So, she's a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, and I think Harris endorsed her back.
Race isn't newness. Sorry.
No, I'm just pointing that out because Colin said, talking about endorsing Biden. I think she's the only one who has publicly endorsed a candidate, and that candidate is Kamala Harris.
Well, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to actually talk very briefly about something that a lot of Democrats do agree on right now, and it's gun control. We're talking with Danielle Altamari from the Hartford Courant, Danny Haar from Hearst, Connecticut Media, Colin McEnroe from the Colin McEnroe Show, and this is the Wheelhouse. This is the Wheelhouse. We're talking about the week's news with Danielle Altamari from the Hartford Courant and Dan Haar from Hearst, Connecticut Media, and our own Colin McEnroe. Colin, what's on your show today?
I have to think about this because we are actually putting a rerun on the air. What are we doing? Oh, tabloids.
Thank you, Kyone.
Yeah,
this is from Colin Wolfe.
We are rerunning one of our old shows, but it's a fun show about tabloids and tabloid journalism.
Excellent. Tabloid journalism. That's a very good topic here on the Colin McEnroe Show. Very quickly, we're going to talk about some things that Democrats and Republicans in the state and in the nation probably are arguing about a lot. But here's one thing that Democrats seem to agree on. A survey we're reading about in the New York Times shows all 19 candidates on stage and also as part of this Democratic field support an assault weapons ban. They really don't disagree on anything having to do with gun control. Daniela, this has sort of changed over the course of the last several years. At this point now in America, most Democrats, not only those running for president, but those who are running for any office and people who are voting for those people all seem to agree that we need some sort of tighter gun control measures in America.
I think that's a measure of efforts on the part of people like Chris Murphy, Senator Murphy, for instance, who decided a few years back that the NRA, incredibly powerful organization, needed a counterpoint, and they've poured a lot of money and a lot of effort into building sort of this, alternative effort campaign to pass stronger gun control laws. It's really I think it's sort of unique and hadn't happened before. But I think after the strings of mass shootings that we've had, people decided people who support stronger gun control laws decided they had to mobilize, and you're seeing now the political clout of these organizations kind of playing out. But
I just wonder, Dan, if we were talking before about whether or not, say, an Elizabeth Warren is in the right place ideologically for America to talk about a Medicare for all. I'm wondering if many of the Democrats, including, we've heard Beto O'Rourke talking about going and getting your AR-15 from you, if the Democratic Party is setting itself up ideologically, especially on the issue of assault weapons, take all the other gun issues aside, for a large number of Americans to actually get behind it, because Republicans, independents, an awful lot of people say we don't really want to change the laws that we have.
Even just by using the word assault weapons, they're getting themselves stuck in a corner with moderates, because there's no it's not realistic to take these guns away. I mean, this is similar to what the left said about Trump when he said we're going to kick out the 11 to 12 million or maybe more undocumented residents in this country. Well, you can't find it, and guns is even harder to find, right? It's like you can't go round people up when you can't find them, and you also can't do it in those numbers. There are between 8 and 16 million military-style semi-automatic weapons. I don't use the word assault rifle because that's an automatic, which is fully illegal except in special cases. But you're not getting them off the streets. It's not happening. It's just simply not happening. And that, exactly as you say, is going to alienate a whole big chunk of the middle. The other thing that I thought was interesting is that there's a debate between licensing and registration. And why they don't line up as the same people, I don't know. But that's a realistic thing. You can say everyone who has a gun needs a license, or you can say everyone who has an existing gun needs to register that gun. That's a further the registration is a further deeper intrusion into people's so-called Second Amendment rights.
I don't see it the same way that Danny does. First of all, I want to say that I think gun reform in general is going to turn out to be like, Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions, the idea that sort of conventional thinking sits along a plane and kind of builds up, and then there are these paradigm shifts where things change very fast. We saw that with gay marriage. Gay marriage in the 1990s was just kind of a non-starter. Now, it's a very acceptable, understandable, recognizable concept. It's approved in a lot of states. So, and federally too. So, I think you're going to see that with guns. And the truth is, almost any gun reform proposal, including the buyback of assault weapons, is workable. The reality that a lot of politicians are missing is that moms and dads and grandparents every day watch these little kids go out to the school bus, and they're scared. They're scared in a way that parents have never been before. And these children grow up with lockdown drills. This is a reality that we didn't have before. And it really makes the gun issue a much more workable issue. I think, first of all, a voluntary buyback program for assault weapons, very easy, I think, to get through. It's the licensing and registration stuff, which I think is really interesting. You're going to see more pushback from sort of mainstream rank-and-file NRA members on that than you will see on the voluntary buyback for assault weapons. That scares them because that's the sort of, the government's getting very interested in who owns what guns. The government wants to be able to find me. But the reality is, you want to have a car in this country, you have to have a driver's license, you have to register your car. You just have to.
And I'll say you have to have insurance too. But
I think any measures to regulate who has what is going to be seen, as you said, as a tipping point issue, and that could be okay. Any measures to ban something that exists in 10 million range, you can't compare to gay marriage as a tipping point because gay marriage had 2.5% unemployment in the 90s. 2/3 of the Fortune 500 companies gave civil benefits, so that changed everything economically. We don't have that in guns.
I want to turn to an issue happening in the state that's had Republicans and Democrats fighting a bit with each other, and it has to do with the Connecticut Republican Party hosting let's just say, controversial speaker who's been criticized quite a bit nationally. Activist James O'Keefe is going to be speaking to Republicans in Shelton on October 24th. It's something, Daniela, that Nancy Wyman has come out to criticize. What are people saying about bringing this, again, I'll use the word controversial speaker. Mm-hmm. Some will use stronger terms than that to the state.
Yeah, I mean, he's a very polarizing figure. Obviously, James O'Keefe with his video stings, and I think it's interesting the supporters of him portray him as a journalist. He's obviously not a journalist by any normal definition of the word. I mean, I think some people were surprised that the Republican Party's bringing him in, but other people seem to be okay with it and think it's a good thing.
I guess this is one of those things, Colin, that I don't quite understand because we do often think about, Connecticut Republicans maybe being different than Republicans in other states. And whenever any part of the Connecticut Republican Party brings in someone like this who is so part of the red meat base of the party, it does kind of raise a few question marks or eyebrows.
Right. I mean, look, O'Keefe is a liar and a con man. His tactics are reprehensible. Most of these videos that he produces that purport to show some malfeasance by somebody are heavily spliced and edited in extremely deceptive ways. His tactics have included things like apparently trying to break into then Senator Mary Landrieu's office to tap the phone system there. And the other thing is that a lot of his stings, his so-called stings, have actually exposed people who pretty right away figure out either that this is some kind of phony thing. They tried to shop a phony Roy Moore tip to the Washington Post. The Washington Post sniffed it out right away. He did this really weird, creepy thing where he tried to lure this female CNN journalist, onto this sex boat that had all this weird, sex toy equipment on it and stuff like that. That got figured. I mean, what was even the purpose of that? But that got figured out pretty quickly. They've tried to infiltrate campaigns. O'Keefe himself infiltrated a Colorado campaign as a Democratic volunteer and then offered to do all this fraudulent ballot stuff. And he was told, oh, no, we don't do that. That's against the law. So he's ineffective. He's a phony. He's a liar. And he's trying to degrade the process of information gathering and reporting in this country. And if that's who J.R. Romano thinks is a big hero, it's further proof that Romano and the people like him are stranding the Connecticut Republican Party in this kind of immature punk, underdeveloped political status. And if you want to remain a second-class party, just keep doing stuff like this.
Danny?
He do the Planned Parenthood baby parts? Mm-hmm. Was that him?
I think so.
He did,
yeah. That was. Okay, so I'm the House conservative on this. I think JR is fine. As long as you're not bringing in somebody who's inciting who's bringing hate speech. I think that should be the red line. Let the market of ideas look at this guy and say this guy's a fraud. And if the Republicans who are so desperate to do anything because they can't repudiate Trump have to bring this guy in, it's going to backfire on them.
But I think that's the question. Why do that if indeed it would backfire? Why would you ever bring in someone who is a liar and a fraud and a cheat? What does that prove?
Because
what point does that make?
Because they can't repudiate Trump, and so they have to act like Trump. Because that's what the Republican Party in Connecticut has become. And I feel real bad for people like Len Fasano, Senator Fasano, who's an old-style centrist Republican.
You talk, Danielle, every day you talk with these old-style, Connecticut Republicans up at the Capitol. I mean, what do they make of this? What do they make of this being the party that they're part of?
Well, I mean, I think the Republicans at the Capitol have a pretty disciplined message on fiscal issues in Connecticut, and things that distract from that they don't really like to wade into. They want to talk about taxes. They want to talk about tolls. They want to talk about Ned Lamont and his grocery tax. That's what they want to talk about. And, we've asked them about Trump many times. We almost really kind of have stopped asking them about Trump because what more can you say?
It would be interesting if their state party actually did the same thing with the same discipline. Colin, we just have a little bit of time left for you.
Yeah, look, if you're an old-style centrist Republican, you should have no trouble speaking out about stuff like this, about what's happening in northern Syria right now, about what was happening at the border with the separations of families. I mean, Republicans in Connecticut, be better. You've got to be better.
I believe Len Fasano did speak out about the border separations.
Border separations.
If I'm remembering correctly,
Yeah.
I think he absolutely issued something on
But
that.
in terms of there being a hue and cry in this state among Republicans about this, it just hasn't happened. And it is different from I actually do believe the Republicans of 10, 15, 20 years ago would have known how to speak out against a lot of this stuff.
We're going to have to take a break here in just a little bit, but I did want to raise one other quick issue on this. We're also seeing, Danny, that Democrats have posted some fairly nasty things about Mayor Aaron Stewart, at least one Democrat, and this has gotten some blowback at this time at which Republicans and Democrats are trading barbs over who comes to a fundraiser. It sounds as though Facebook posts have gotten people angry.
Well, it's an old Facebook post that this guy didn't do as part of the campaign. It was the debate is whether it was about a year ago or more than a year ago, and obviously this stuff doesn't bear repeating. Unfortunately, Mayor Stewart has been the victim of a few of these sorts of things. Maybe because she's so young, I don't know. It's just I don't see that as a partisan or party thing.
I wonder what it could be. You think it's just because she's young?
Yeah.
What else is different about her?
I'm saying among women. Among women. Give me a break. What are you talking about? Among women.
We're going to tell you what. We're going to take a break, and we're going to we're going to have a little conversation in here amongst ourselves, and we're going to turn it over to some colleagues who are going to have a conversation with you about how you can support Connecticut Public Radio and everything that you hear here on our station. We'll be right back in the Wheelhouse. This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky, talking about the week's news with Danielle Altamari of the Hartford Courant, Dan Haar of Hearst Connecticut Media, and our own Colin McEnroe. We've got a few more stories to talk about before we hear some feats of strength. I'm going to read here from the Hartford Courant. Former UConn basketball coach Jim Calhoun issued a statement Saturday responding to allegations of sexual discrimination and creating a hostile work environment contained in a federal lawsuit filed October 9th against the University of St. Joseph by the school's former associate athletic director. So, Colin, Calhoun, of course, one of the best-known figures in Connecticut, not just sports history, but in Connecticut, period. He comes out of retirement to help start a men's basketball program in a Division III school. This is a school that only recently started to admit men, and now there is this controversy. What do you see in this lawsuit?
A lot. First of all, there's sort of two different questions here. One of them is has to do with when you read the complaint has the kind of detail in it that typically makes these cases a lot stronger. It's a very well-detailed complaint. But it kind of describes two different things. One of them is a cultural change at St. Joseph, where because, in fact, there was this kind of male sports program coming in, all kinds of things happened, including the plaintiff lost an office that she needed. Like 3 guys got moved in with her. And suddenly they were being treated, some of the women who'd been there in important roles were being treated like second-class citizens. Then there are these very specific issues about, was she told she was hot? Was she, verbally diminished in certain ways? There's a description of Calhoun knocking some Keurig pods on the floor and stepping on them and crushing them and then telling them that she should clean it up because his wife would do that. That kind of stuff, is disturbing. It'll only work in a lawsuit if there's another corroborating testimony. In other words, you need a third party to corroborate some of this stuff. Jim Calhoun is just a very puzzling figure. I want to admire this man. But when you watch what happened in UConn, where the program began to deteriorate, there were huge recruiting violations and academic performance violations. There was Calhoun's courtside behavior, which became more and more aberrant. These explosions of temper at his own players, sometimes manhandling them, grabbing them by the jersey and dragging them over. He's a guy he's not the guy we want him to be. And I was hoping that this new phase of his career would bring out that softer, more poetic side that I remember from some of his early days. And, you can't judge him now. This whole thing has to play out in some kind of way. I'm kind of hoping there won't be a closed-off settlement where we never really know what happened. It would be really important and interesting to know, ultimately, what the truth of this is.
You were hoping for a poetic side? Really?
Jim Calhoun.
What state have you been living in for these 30 years?
Every time I go to a Broadway musical tour at the Bushnell, Calhoun is there. He loves Broadway musicals. There's a lot of aspects to him that don't fit this other guy that
lovely.
we've seen.
He is who he is. Then men's basketball culture is men's basketball culture, and that's really what Piscatelli's suit is about. It comes at this from a cultural aspect, and if there are incidents of behavior like the Keurig cups, then that would have to rise. But I really think that this is a broader, almost like a public issue about the change in culture that happens. And Rona Free, who's the very, very great president of St. Joseph, has an issue on her hands regardless of what happens with this lawsuit.
Yeah, and Danielle, this is a culture clash that has to do not just with a school that very recently was a women's college. This is a place my wife graduated from, the old St. Joseph College some years ago. So it's become a very different place. But it's not just that a men's basketball culture is part of this. It's that a Division 1A style men's basketball culture. This is a very different thing. Basketball at the University of Connecticut and schools like it, your Louisvilles and your North Carolinas, this is big business. The person who is the coach is like the president and the god all wrapped up into one. And this is being put into a place that has not experienced anything like this, even close to like this before. And that could be a big part of what's happening here.
Yeah, I mean, think about, the role Jim Calhoun played in Connecticut for decades, as Colin, kind of laid out there. I mean, this was a guy that was, bigger than almost anything. And you're right, to shoehorn that into, this small program at this small school that's kind of under the radar. I mean, perhaps it's not surprising that there would be these kinds of clashes. It's really, the allegations laid out in this lawsuit are really troubling and disturbing. I mean, there's no getting around that.
I think it's also important to realize that there's almost a kind of self-infantilization, a willed self-infantilization that goes on among sports fans, and they make these coaches into these weird kinds of father figures. And if you look at the Penn State community's defense of Joe Paterno, as the evidence built up and got bigger and more horrific, and there's still this Joe Pa stuff, and there's a little bit of that in this state about Calhoun, right? He's coach. Coach wouldn't do that. Coach needs time to explain himself. Look, he's not your coach. Don't call him coach. But there's this sense that these people are kind of, above reproach, above accusation. You're going to hear a lot of that if this suit unfolds in a fairly public way.
Coach explained himself by missing the point. He talked only about behavior, not about culture, in his long explanation yesterday.
Well, we're going to go to our section of the program that we, and this isn't the section at the end where we talk about feats of strength or grievances. It's Toll Watch. We're going to talk about tolls for just a minute here because
we need a jingle.
There's always something to talk about when it comes to tolls. You're writing, Dan Haar, that this big gap that we have in funding means that tolls are unavoidable. We've sort of been saying this, but we went away from talking about tolls for quite some time. Both Republicans and Ned Lamont were saying there's other ways to find money. We can bond for this. We can find money from the federal government. So are tolls inevitable now?
This is where we're seeing Ned Lamont's poetic side come out. And he's going to be...
Ned's a poet.
Yeah.
I can't have Calhoun as a poet, but you have Ned as a poet.
Ned is a sensitive guy of the 90s. So, no, just looking at the numbers, I felt as though nobody had really looked at this through the eyes of what do the numbers say. And so just pulling... First of all, it shouldn't have taken me 2 full days of work to find numbers that should be clear on a piece of paper somewhere. But that's a different story about how Connecticut does its budget. The bottom line is that debt is rising for transportation bonding that has already taken place and that now will take place just to keep the roads where they are now by $300 million a year, from about $650 to about $950 million over the next 4 and 5 years. Right? So it's not the case that we can just keep doing what we're doing because as with the pensions, the debt is rising. And we can argue all we want about whether that money was wasted or well spent. The reality is it's debt that's rising in the next 5 years. And then on the demand side, we've basically been spending $1.5 billion a year on roads and bridges and transit systems, keeping them up to speed. We did add the Hartford rail line, and we've done the Waterbury, I guess it's forever Waterbury work, but that's Waterbury work, you know that, on the highway, on 84. But for the most part, we're basically keeping things just up to speed. So you need to spend another $300 million a year doing 1 or 1.5 major projects per year on average to get to where we need to be in terms of making the chokeholds, the Waterbury Mixmaster, the Hartford Viaduct, the Bridgeport 8 interchange, the Norwalk Bridge, the Gold Star Bridge. These are the choke points. And if you're going to do that, you got to spend $300 million a year more. Now, can you do that can you spend $300 million a year less on the stuff you've already been doing? That's going to be the debate. But the bottom line is the numbers say we're short by $600 million a year, which has to be partly taken up by tolls because we can't borrow anymore.
Daniela, so I mean, if that's the math, if Danny's math is right, and I'll trust him on this, then what are they saying at the Capitol about this? Because at a certain point, you got to pay for this somehow.
So at the big transportation summit with all the leaders and the committee heads and all that a couple weeks ago at the DOT building, it was funny. All of us reporters were waiting outside, and the first person to come out was Alex Bergstein, and she's like, basically, I don't know what these people are smoking. They think the feds are going to come and bail them out. That's not probably going to happen. She poured cold water over all of this talk, and then you had leaders from both parties come out, Republicans and Democrats, saying, hey, this is great. We're going to get federal money. We're going to, participate in all these programs. We won't have to pay these loans off for years and years. We can do, we can tap into this. This is basically, the solution to all our needs. So it was really a sort of a jarring juxtaposition.
Yeah, and meanwhile, over these intervening years, we're going to find a goose that lays a golden egg. I mean, what's the plan for coming up with how you pay that money down the road? As Danny said, we have this problem already with the pensions because we did just this thing. I
think the quote from either Bob Duff, or who's the majority leader in the Senate, or Matt Ritter, I can't remember who, but basically the takeaway was, we don't need to worry about that now.
The federal, just want to quickly say, the federal Build America money that everybody's talking about that's going to bail us out, I did a bunch of calculating on that, and it's about 10 to 20, maybe $30 million a year of savings, not the big nut.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of a miniature version of the state income tax debate, those many decades ago, right? I mean, ultimately, Weicker got in and said, look, the numbers just don't work any other way. He had campaigned against a state income tax, and he got in there and said, I can't make it work. We can't make it work any other way. And he until even now, he still takes heat over that. Whoever makes the mature decision about actually paying for the infrastructure that we use is going to suffer. And they're going to suffer for having been the more grown-up person. And borrowing, the Republican fondness for borrowing in this state, I mean, our bonded indebtedness is very, very high right now. As Danny's pointing out, these loans start to cost more in some cases. We can't borrow our way out of all these problems.
And very quickly, Dan, if we're talking about paying a political price, are Republicans in the state who are at least listening to Ned Lamont and the numbers that you're putting out there, are they poised to maybe pay some sort of political price if they say anything other than toll's bad, toll's bad?
Well, that's what happened with Caitlin Krasel's story on Friday or Thursday night, where she said they're willing to listen and that's new. That is the two Republican leaders, and they came back at us by saying, no, we're not willing to consider tolls. We're willing to listen to Lamont's plan. And so that's the level of subtle distinction here. One is I'm willing to listen to the plan. The other is I'm willing to consider tolls, even though the plan is tolls.
All right. Let's move on to our final segment. Our final segment is always maybe a feat of strength or a grievance that you have. And Daniela, I'll start with you. What's on your mind this week?
Well, something that you asked me earlier. I think my feat of strength would be a recommendation for people to make granola. It's cheaper. It's better. You can make it exactly the way you want it. And it's super easy. You just basically throw the oats in the oven with some maple syrup or some honey and a little, olive oil or something to moisten it a little bit. Throw some nuts in. It's way less expensive than the stuff you buy at the grocery store, and it's way better.
And it's not subject to any of those prepared food taxes.
Right.
Exactly.
And you've got another career option, too. The way that you make it, it really sounds really good. I would buy your granola.
Altamari granola. I like this. I think this is a very good idea. So thank you for that suggestion. Maybe we'll put a recipe up online. Danny, how about you?
I'm going to follow Daniela's lead in staying away from policy. Let's talk about the great fall weather that we're having. And my annual, that's my feat of strength. My annual grievance is it's noise season. And, if people would please use a broom and a rake, you might find it's good for you too. Everywhere you go, I wake up and I try to listen to how many leaf blowers I'm hearing at a time. And usually I can identify 6 different ones.
There's a big Atlantic story about noise in our environment.
Noise,
it's actually really important. It's not a small issue.
Yeah, that's a big deal.
Colin, how about you?
2 quick ones. So my grievance is we spent a lot of following up on the Calhoun thing. We spent so much money on this state on Division I football, including a $93 million stadium that for the most part is not used for much of anything else except for really, really bad football. So on Saturday, I picked up the paper. There was a 34-point spread between Tulane and UConn. You don't see 34-point spreads that often. And I thought to myself, well, who would ever bet on Tulane if it's a 34-point spread? Well, you should have.
Well, I'll just say, and this is Tulane. This is not Alabama.
No, right. Yeah, it's
Michigan.
Tulane. Yeah, it's not this huge superpower in football. 49-7, I think, was the final score there. This is like just a terrible program. It costs a lot of money to run. It's my grievance. My feat of strength is that ProPublica and Texas Tribune, 2 of the real sort of gold standard 21st century journalism organizations in America, are combining. They are collaborating to launch an investigative journalism project in Texas. They've got about $6 million in launch funding. This is the kind of thing you should get excited about.
And I'll just say quickly, that's sort of on the heels of NPR and the stations in Texas in the public radio system getting together to form a new Texas newsroom. We're over-serving Texas, maybe underserving other parts of the nation. In a lot of the Gulf Coast states, there is a true news desert. Not a whole lot of reporters, editors, newspapers.
Arkansas's biggest newspaper, I think. Little Rock's biggest newspaper just went out. Arkansas's biggest newspaper.
Sunday only. They're going to go to Sunday only, I think.
Yeah, and so good for Texas, but I will say that a lot of other places in America, there's not a lot of great news coverage. I'm actually going to give a feat of strength to Connecticut Public Radio and television working together on a documentary that you can see tomorrow night, October 17th at 8 o'clock. It's called Collision Course, and it's about the shooting in Wethersfield that brought together a young man, an 18-year-old man who was shot to death by a Wethersfield police officer, and that police officer. These 2 young people were on very similar paths, families that move from Hartford to the suburbs, and it goes in a very nuanced way into this tragedy and also some of the reasons for it. So check out Collision Course on Connecticut Public Television. I want to thank our panelists, as always, Daniela Altamari from the Hartford Courant. Thank you, Daniela.
Thank you.
Thanks to Danny Haar from Hearst, Connecticut Media. Thanks, Dan.
Great to be here.
Colin McEnroe from the Colin McEnroe Show. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you, Mr. Dankosky.
And now we're going to turn it over to our friends to tell you why you should support Connecticut Public Radio.